The big surprise to me has been just the month after month, quarter after quarter, the goalposts are moving, and what constituted best practice last year is no longer good enough this year. You have to separate the hype and the demos from the reality of the implementations. You're completely divorced from the hype when you're talking about real practical implementation challenges.
Welcome to another episode of the Alpha Intelligence Podcast. Today I'm joined by James Corcoran. He's head of AI and analytics at STAC, a global group that works with financial firms to test and benchmark the technologies they rely on. James is based in Cork, Ireland, and has spent years working at the intersection of finance, data, and AI. He's also a certified risk manager and holds a master's in quantitative finance. Excited to have him here, which we've been trying to do for the last few weeks. As we were getting started, we were talking about the travel tour you've been on. Maybe you could start with what the last few weeks have been like, maybe the kind of questions you get from folks and where you see us in this AI framework.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, thanks a billion, Matt, for having me on. Big fan of the podcast, and it's great to be here. Last few weeks and months been busy, like everyone else working in the AI space, right? So much going on. Just keeping on top of everything isn't a job in itself. But yeah, over the last few weeks, we've had several conferences for our customers, which they're top banks, top hedge funds, and trading firms. In the financial services industry, and we've been in Singapore, London, New York, and Chicago. So I'm just back from that leg of trips, and straight away it's back into the research part of my job. So we do a lot of research into new and emerging technology platforms. We do a lot of benchmarking of different technology platforms as they relate to and are applied to financial services use cases and workloads. So everything is very user centric, and we can get into some of that. But right now I've got my research hat on, and we're doing a lot of interesting work in the space.
Who's the point person for a lot of these companies? Because it seems like these roles are sort of new. Obviously, if you're like chief technology officer, like who's the point person you're talking to?
There's different organizational models that I've observed. Most recently saw Jamie Dimon speaking at a conference. Was saying his chief AI officer reports directly into him. So that's one way of doing it, to sort of elevate the AI conversation directly to the C-suite within the bank. The other model that I've heard quite a bit of is you've got this sort of AI center of excellence. Quite a few firms, I think, are doing this, where you've got a centralized team responsible for keeping on top of the latest AI research, maybe developing the bank's own AI research. Quite a few banks actually are publishing papers, which is really encouraging to see. And then developing policies, and then leaving sort of the implementation of the AI to the application teams which sit within the lines of business. So I think that's quite a sensible model. I've seen it being built out and deployed in several of our customers, and it seems to be working well.
What's top of mind in the research world?
Well, like everyone else, we're looking at all the different models that come out and how quickly that's evolving. But our particular focus area is on the infrastructure underneath. So we do a lot of analysis of different hardware platforms, compute platforms, cloud platforms, and try to figure out what are the best dynamics to support a given model, whether that's an LLM or a machine learning model or whatever. And we're looking at different factors that are important to our customers and the financial services industry. Model quality is one, and it's amazing how sometimes the quality or the fidelity or faithfulness of a model can change when the underlying infrastructure platform changes. That's one area we're
interesting
digging into. And then you've got sort of the unit economics of all of this. It's all very well and good sort of making a call on this model is best for our use cases, but is it a good fit economically? Do we like sort of the inferencing costs? Are there any sort of training or fine-tuning costs that were likely to occur periodically? So we help the financial services industry sort of map all of that out in a data-driven way.
And that's, you said, go at this in a data-driven way. Like, how do you really figure out those judgment calls?
Yeah, it's definitely a tough challenge, right? One of the approaches we're taking is to look at it from the lens of model risk perspective. So if you think about sort of the financial services industry, there are quantitative models out there that large parts of the market consume from third-party suppliers and sort of agree on. And so you have data vendors, for example, that'll give models or market snapshots or whatever. And everyone agrees that that's the standard, and they all consume it and they build applications on top of it. And so you can kind of, and so there's model risk methodologies and frameworks built into the risk management systems of these banks to figure out if something changes upstream, alarms will get triggered and we can take corrective action within our data or our applications within the bank or the firm. One of the things we're looking at is whether you can apply the same sort of thinking and logic to the LLM space. And specifically, if you're a bank and you're consuming an LLM as a service, you may not know exactly what model version is running behind an API. Or you might be told one, but there might be quantization behind the scenes. There might be all sorts of optimizations from the model provider, and that you're consuming. And you want to try and figure out, if my model is changing from day to day, and will that impact the quality of, the reports that I'm building or whatever use case you're using the model for. So we're building tools to detect subtle but measurable changes in upstream models. Then on the flip side, we're also doing quite a lot of research to figure out what are the economics or the factors that will lead you towards leaning to building the AI stack yourself rather than calling an API. And so looking at the infrastructure that you need and whether it's GPU clusters and then vector databases and then application stacks on top, that's an alternative to using an LLM as a managed service and trying to give customers the trade-off and the pros and cons of both approaches so that they can figure out what's best for their needs. That's all part of the research that we provide.
Are most clients looking for, okay, all these vendors are out here, we want to get a better sense of what may work best for us? Where are they in this process?
I think most of them are starting to look at that sort of strategic view across the enterprise. If you look at sort of last year, 2024 was all about building prototypes, POCs, maybe getting a couple of them to production. And you might do that on a business line by business line basis. Most people now, at the executive level, they're looking at, what's our AI strategy, what's our data strategy to support that, and then what's our partner strategy, which which parts of this overall kind of equation can we outsource versus which parts do we bring in house. The other kind of nuance that you need to bear in mind is that models and model versions are changing incredibly quickly. So one question is, how quickly can I keep up with the latest versions? How quickly can I test them, approve upgrade cycles? So that's one piece. Maybe it's not the right idea to stay always on the bleeding edge. Maybe you stay on the bleeding edge -1. So that's another thing we've heard. But then the other side is, you've got to think a little bit longer term if you're looking at physical infrastructure, whether it's building your own GPU clusters to train fine-tune models. Big firms are doing quite a lot of that. And then the other decision factor is, do I run this stuff on-prem? Should I be running in the cloud? And if I'm in the cloud, at what level do I go to the as-a-service model? Because you can run physical infrastructure in the cloud and build everything up yourselves, or you can go all the way to the top and consume a model as a service, or have something in the middle. So there's just so many decisions to be made when you're thinking about the AI stack.
What's your sense of where we are in adoption? People have mentioned this sort of similar to like cloud computing in 2008, right?
Good question. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, things are moving so quickly, you kind of think that, like we're so far into the cycle, and I can't keep up, and everyone's racing down the street. But at the same time, you sort of take a step back, and you have to think that we're quite early into the overall AI cycle, and what constitutes best practice today in terms of the technology implementation side of AI is probably not going to prevail for even 6 months or 12 months into the future, because there'll be different application style or architecture or different way of implementing AI into existing applications and building new applications. So I tend to think that, despite the enormous progress to date, we're still very early in this cycle. To compare it to cloud, it's interesting. Like, I think in particular the financial services industry was everyone was sort of initially slow to embrace cloud, and then everyone decided, okay, let's embrace cloud and let's go to the cloud. But then once the decision is made, you still are in these multi-year programs, piecemeal move applications to the cloud, and you would then sort of ring fence certain applications and say, no, that's left on-prem, and then these ones are less risky that they can move to the cloud. And yeah, just really lengthy programs to sort of get the bank to the cloud. And there's probably not many large financial institutions which would proudly say, yeah, the whole bank runs on cloud today, right? So there's this hybrid environment, even though cloud was a thing many, many years ago. I think with AI,
Right.
things are moving faster, and you can see, every team in every organization, upskilling on AI. Employees are getting sort of AI as productivity tools, and they're coming to the desktop, and that's probably the easier piece of it. But even within the lines of business, you can see that people are finding ways to integrate AI into their business applications, and I would suspect that in terms of velocity, sort of the AI trend will be a little bit quicker in the industry than the cloud was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my sense as well, is that it's very early on and it's happening very fast. I mean, even 18 months ago, getting summary of earnings recalls
Mm-hmm.
was new and novel. And hey, Francesco, actually, you
Hey,
came in a good time. We were sort of in between
yeah.
questions.
All right.
James, Francesco,
Hey, James.
this is actually good for me because then I can sort of see if I have the main, most salient points of James so far. So
Okay.
we're talking about STAC and how they're very much in demand. We were going through who do you even talk to at a bank who's implementing these strategies. You made an interesting point about how you can test the same model on different hardware and get different results, which I was unaware of. And as you were coming in, we were talking about adoption and how things are happening very quickly, but it's also like we're also like nerds and very much into this world. Because I think for a lot of people, I was just reading a Gallup poll that had like 13% of people who never used AI, like, oh, it's not gonna help me. And then after they used it, it was like 80%. So
Right.
I think there's still like a lot of like, oh, what is this thing? It's gonna be like what my kids say about, us and the internet. You know what I mean? Like, oh, what is this weird thing?
How could you be doing research or something when you had to go to the library
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
to to go get your
Well,
Google
information?
links, like a whole bunch of blue links.
I
Mm.
think Sam Altman had this thing the other day, didn't he, where he was saying the older generation are using ChatGPT as a sort of Google replacement or a search replacement. The sort of middle generation are using it as an assistant, and then the younger generation are using it as an operating system. And I just thought it was kind of a useful framework to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's wild, like how much, I've written a little bit about this in the newsletter about how like AI is picking like stock portfolios, which for somebody, who's closer to retirement, they'd be like, oh, I would never do that. But if you're like 28 or whatever, it's fine.
Yeah. Exactly. I
Hmm.
mean, I think the question there is like, how much do you lean on AI for productivity, and then how much do you lean on it for sort of insight and so the implementation, the generation of ideas, and then the implementation of ideas, and that's obviously where AI comes in. But productivity,
Hmm.
you would imagine there'll just be a wave of adoption that it'll feel like it just has happened overnight, and everyone will use AI in their day-to-day working lives in the same way that they use Microsoft Office today. So I fully expect that to happen. Then the question is within finance on the trading desk or other business applications, how quickly we integrate AI into those workloads and how much trust we place in it. And again, I think research and benchmarking and testing has a big role to play in that.
What are people most attuned to when they see you at a conference?
The questions are definitely evolving. So, a couple of years ago, was people trying to get their heads around the whole space. A lot of conferences a few years ago were frankly educational. Educating the market, practitioners on this is what an LLM does, this is how Gen AI works. I talk, in the early days of RAG and how you build applications that can feed knowledge base or context from proprietary data set within the firm and give that to an LLM. The content and the questions that we get asked has definitely evolved and become more sophisticated as people get further along their adoption journey. As you can imagine, sort of towards the end of last year, a lot of the talk was on agentic AI, but you have to separate the hype and the demos from the reality, the implementations. And that's the space we're in. We're trying to help customers really implement these technologies and make big decisions on what model they go with, what technology platform they go with, how it interoperates across the firm, which suppliers that they partner with. And so you're completely divorced from the hype when you're talking about real practical implementation challenges. And so our events tend to be focused on that side of things, and they can get quite technical quite quickly. And we tend to have less of the kind of flashy demos of the latest agentic AI workflow or whatever. That said, there's plenty of reason to be excited about that stuff as well.
And you were saying earlier, there's some folks taking the stance of like bleeding edge -1 in terms of like where they want to adopt because it is happening so quickly. Can you sort of walk through the thinking of bleeding edge -1?
Yeah, and I originally saw this many years ago in the software market where a lot of vendors would stay on the latest release -1 just because they wanted sort of the market and other customers to regression test the latest versions of a product before they would do their own testing cycles and promote it into production. I think that's sort of a cautious but pragmatic approach, and you don't do that with every product, of course. A lot of products you just sort of take off the shelf and upgrade as the upgrades hit you. But for the more mission critical your product is sort of the more cautious you tend to see customers at adopting upgrades and maybe having much longer regression cycles. And that's probably what it boils down to, having lengthier regression testing the latest version -1. Now, when you look at the model side of things, people are just starting to apply the same sort of mindset, particularly if a new model comes out and it's all very well and good sort of testing that on an individual basis, and anecdotally it might sort of feel like you're consuming a much better version of a model. But has that been tested at scale throughout the organization? Has every risk manager signed off on it? And has it been tested specifically against our use cases and our data? And can we guarantee that there's going to be better performance in terms of quality and other factors by consuming this upgrade? And it just takes a little bit longer to get the answer to those questions. So you can see people staying just slightly off the bleeding edge. And then you have the practicalities of procurement. And some of these model upgrades, if you're consuming as a service behind an API, they might be automatic. But if you're not, and you're building your own stack, then just the procurement aspect of getting a new version into the firm, it just takes longer as well. And the way these models are getting released and the timelines associated with them is so fast that just from a practicality perspective, you're not always ready to consume the next version.
Yeah. I remember sometimes at Bloomberg when they put out an update, you could do new and old, right? You'd have like the function be like the same application or the old application. And some people were like on the same old application for years. They're like, I don't want the new one.
Exactly.
I know where things are in the old one.
Exactly. Sometimes it's easier to stay comfortable.
Are you getting a lot of interest from financial firms in that they want everything designed on premises because they don't want to be sending their data out
Yes,
to the APIs?
we have a lot of those customers, and that requirement is common across many of the big players. There's an analogy there because before kind of Gen AI, like we do a lot of research and still doing benchmarking in the machine learning space. Before machine learning, we did a lot of stuff and still doing the analytics space and the trading and the low latency space. So we were very well used to having air-gapped environments, very tightly locked down infrastructure where there's a single path for data to flow through. It's very well governed, and it's the exact same firms, the same cast of characters who are responsible for implementing AI, at the firm level. And so you have all of the same concerns and the same thinking, and that gets you sort of designed for all of the non-functional requirements, as much as it's fun to look at, which model is best at doing a maths problem or whatever on the functional side. The non-functional stuff is what takes up the vast majority of the time in many cases.
Hmm.
Do you sort of prioritize like what information that they're willing to send out? How do you sort of manage that issue?
Yeah, you could see prototypes getting built on the public cloud, LLMs being provided as a service, but then implemented at scale, either on-prem or within private cloud, where the LLM is being managed and deployed by the firm. So I think that could be a big trend. The data, it's kind of like the analogy that I would draw to the cloud movement was when firms are trying to prioritize which applications go to the cloud, it's kind of like a risk assessment. With the cloud, a lot of real-time systems stayed on-prem and a lot of the historical systems moved to the cloud. And that was just a risk managed way of doing the migration. I think firms will probably take a similar sort of approach. It'll be a different dimension, so it won't be real time versus historical, but it'll be a risk assessed approach of which data can we integrate into our AI workloads first, and then what follows thereafter once we prove that it can work and we work in a controlled way.
Has AI changed the mix of folks using STAC?
So it's definitely bringing new customers into STAC and new firms into the STAC community. We have a very strong community where it's about, a large part of it is about knowledge sharing, either through our research, which we make available to everyone, or at conferences and industry events where there's a lot of deep conversation and knowledge sharing. So we're attracting a lot of new people to the community, which is great. The use cases, I think they have started and will be implemented at the individual productivity level. So at least from a STAC perspective, we see is kind of solved. Not quite solved exactly yet, but that's not our focus. Our focus is on sort of the wider kind of enterprise implementation of AI at the business level, into the application stacks and building new applications. So definitely on the trading side, people are absolutely looking at using LLMs and transformer-based models to apply to whether it's time series data or other data that'll go into portfolio management, trading decisions, risk management decisions, trade ideation. The whole idea of that has been talked about a lot. So we support in that area. Then, the communication out to clients, a lot of data privacy concerns there that need to be thought about and implemented thoughtfully. And there's no area of the bank that, to go back to the quote from Jamie Dimon, there's no area of the bank that isn't impacted or touched by AI.
It's interesting you talk about time series data and
Mm.
transformer tech sort of more broadly. It's something that I didn't realize until a couple of months ago about how the architecture was trained on language, but it can be trained on other data sets. And that to me is very interesting. It's compelling. Where do you see that in this cycle?
We've looked into sort of transformer-based models for time series. The jury's out on whether it can definitely be applied, but whether or not the results are as good as or better than the types of models that are applied to time series today remains to be seen. That's our view, and we see differing views amongst the different players in the market. Some have published papers on it, and so not quite a consensus, I would say, out there yet. The one area where I think a lot of people agree is that you can use AI, Gen AI and LLMs to, for example, interpret charts. That's a use case, and you can sort of use that in isolation. That's very different to trying to apply a transformer-based model directly to time series data. So you can definitely do both. We've seen people construct portfolio of models and then sort of weight them individually so that you get this balanced view of, if you're trying to build a forecast for the market, you have traditional models, you have transformer-based models, you might have some image-based pattern recognition models, and then sort of throw it all into the mix and see where your forecast comes out. So that's, some people are experimenting with that sort of approach as well. We do a lot of work on the LLM space, but we also have a classical, if you can call it that, machine learning benchmark. It started off as a benchmark to run neural network based calculations for market data inferencing. So you're trying to forecast the next market data tick for the purposes of trading or hedging in real time. We recently upgraded that benchmark to use gradient boosted trees. So now you can use a neural network based model or gradient boosted trees. And again, that's in the classical machine learning space. And that's as vibrant and dynamic an area as the whole Gen AI space. And these things somewhat come together some parts of the research, but they're distinct research domains for us.
I've been surprised, but everyone says like you're getting more juice out of the LSTMs than transformer models or any sort of time series models. One of my thoughts is, because I haven't actually tried to build a price-based transformer myself, but I feel like everyone's trying to train these at the same scale that they train a LSTM or standard sort of time series model. Whereas I feel like I've yet to see someone who has gotten basically any time series they can find, dump it into a transformer, and then test against the standard models.
Yeah, exactly. And I think all of the data points towards, in this particular domain of time series, smaller is probably better. That the data that we see, at least in the research we see, and the conversations that we have, leads us to have conviction that sort of smaller is better. We test neural network stuff, we test deep learning stuff, we test gradient boosted trees. They're all good at different things, and it's not an either or, particularly in the world of electronic trading. One of the nice things about GPT, for example, is they've less predictive power than neural networks, but they're quicker to train, inference is faster, and they're more explainable. Those are important factors for some scenarios. And maybe there are other scenarios where speed is more important. And so it's almost never an either or. And quite often we're running both types of model families and look to implement the next one as well.
The folks you're speaking to are very sophisticated. Anything that like hype wise annoys you, like that you think is being like oversold? Any pet peeves?
Pet peeves. It's not so much a pet peeve, but my antenna go up when we're talking about agentic AI. I believe in the possibility of it, and you can see it in the demos and the things people are building. But to run any sort of agentic style application in production, particularly when there's real money on the line, the amount of test cycles and all sorts of non-functional considerations they have to bake into that picture, lead me to believe that the sort of the adoption cycle there is a little bit lengthier than the hype might lead you to believe. The other, not so much pet peeve, but sort of view, I guess, is that you see a lot of really shiny, flashy front ends in the AI market, and with enterprise software and enterprise tech, particularly in finance, but it's true of other industries as well. Quite often you're talking about back-end infrastructure, and sort of the bigger the firm, the more likely they are to take sort of the back end and connect directly to APIs and try to orchestrate things themselves and maybe put their own UI on top.
Now with the coding agents, front ends are pretty easy to come across.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you mentioned coding agents, because that for sure is a use case I really believe in, and I think the market has sort of proven that itself really that is an area where you can see massive business value in developer productivity, and the tools there are showing very seriously good results at scale in large companies who are not afraid to talk about the benefits that they've enjoyed from using coding assistants. So that definitely, if I was to carve out a slice of the kind of where AI is having the biggest impact today, it would probably be that one.
Yeah. I recently started a new project. I'm mainly like a Python user and haven't really done much front end stuff, or at least connecting front end, back end, and doing all that logic. When I write Python code with the language models, it's like easy. I'll be like, okay, you got this part wrong. I can just look at it and I can see. But I haven't really done too much like TypeScript and I'm looking at stuff and I'm just blindly putting it, and you go in these circles sometimes. So I think people always talk about this concept of, you don't need to learn how to code anymore.
Mm,
But I was learning TypeScript by having to just constantly debug. And if I blindly put stuff there
yeah.
that it's telling me, I end up going these circular like debugging routes. It's just kind of funny because I always tell people, oh, just use ChatGPT. And I'm like, well, that's because I can look at the code that comes out and really edit it
Yeah,
well.
totally, totally, yeah.
Uh,
Well, it's amazing as well, like how cool TypeScript is, and
yeah.
taking TypeScript to a new level, I think. Um, and like speaking of Python, we do a lot of our reference benchmarks in Python because it sort of kind of sets a standard.
Mhm.
It shows kind of how a benchmark is constructed. But when it comes to actually implementing it and trying to show the most optimized version of system for a given use case, quite often the software is written in C++ or another language. And
Mhm.
so obviously it's
Yeah.
everywhere
Yeah.
and people write everything in Python. But for the highly optimized systems, and again that's where we end up focusing a lot of our time and effort on, and kind of lower, even lower level languages are as as important as they ever were.
What to you has been like most surprising over the last few years?
Hmm. I suppose just the relentless pace of change. You could see, particularly at the foundation model level, the frontier is just constantly moving and really kind of showing no signs of stopping. At some point, maybe it'll plateau and then the innovation will come out elsewhere. And I thought it was a really interesting moment when DeepSeek came out, and all of a sudden, the world realized that hardware scarcity can often be a good thing and it can lead to innovation at the software level. So that was a bit of a surprise. But in general, the big surprise to me has been just the month after month, quarter after quarter, the goalposts are moving, and what constituted best practice last year is no longer good enough this year. So it's very exciting to be working in the space, isn't it? I think the big tech companies going all out, investing so much on the model side, the infrastructure side, has been eye opening as well. And it'll be interesting to see where the market goes next.
We were talking earlier about cloud. I mean, at least you could, or at least I could conceptually, all right, well, we're hardware to get to the cloud, okay.
Yeah.
Whereas, how does this impact us in a few years? So, is there any sort of use cases that you think are sort of, we kind of went overhyped, but underhyped?
Hmm. Let me think.
Maybe there's just too much hype out there in general.
Well, you know, the areas that get most attention are on the sort of the consumer side, because it's the easiest to conceptualize and experience. Just on a person, create an account with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. So they inevitably get the most attention. Then you kind of go into the sort of the business application layer, and there's quite a bit of enterprise attention there, because you're thinking about, well, how can I use this amazing new AI technology to deliver better business results, better performance. Probably an area that often gets overlooked would be regulatory compliance, reporting, and things like that. And that's a very important part of the industry, an important part of every industry. It's cost of doing business, and so there's always a motivation to drive costs down, but at the same time, there's a very high bar to achieving compliance, particularly in finance. So there's probably areas of that space that can be heavily disrupted by AI. Getting the balance right between governance and autonomy is probably a very important balancing act. That could be one that I'm sure people are looking at, but you don't see a lot of news cycles focused on that area.
Is there anything else that we should have asked you?
Covered covered quite a bit, didn't we? We published a few research papers recently, but I think I covered most of the topics in them.
And is that sort of your cycle at Stack? So you have your conference, you have your sort of research, and then you go through it? Because it sounds like from what you described earlier is that there's kind of a back and forth to a lot of the folks that you service and work with about what they're seeing as well.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, we're a research company, and as part of our research, we do quite a bit of benchmarking. The most important thing when constructing a benchmark is that it is led by end users, the people who actually consume this technology and use it on a day-to-day basis, because there's no point in benchmarking sort of technology for technology's sake. This thing is faster than that thing or whatever. The value only comes when it's incredibly well aligned with a specific use case and an application. For example, we have a risk calculation benchmark. Ultimately, what we're testing underneath that is the power of different compute grids and the scalability of them and the resilience of them. But it's not about those raw numbers. It's about, how well can this compute grid handle a very particular type of risk calculation that runs, millions and millions of simulations and has to compute lots of numbers and data in parallel. So when you apply that to AI, again, it's not so much about, the the motivations of a model provider. I want to show that in this benchmark, this model is better than that model for this use case. It's about being completely user led and understanding what's of most importance and most urgent to them. We construct benchmarks around those use cases, and then we go and test different technology and model platforms to how well they execute against those. So that's the way STAC works. In order to facilitate those conversations and the engagement with the end user community within the financial firms, we have working groups, and then we also run several conferences, events throughout the year. We were in London, New York, Chicago, and Singapore a couple of months ago. We got our heads down on research this summer. And then in September, we're out in Sydney and Tokyo, and then we go back to London and New York in October.
Wow. It's interesting, the business model. I mean, you have Wall Street, which is a little open source in the sense of like, okay, well, there's a community of users and we're trying to wrap our arms around the kind of issues they're facing.
Exactly. It's very community driven. We try to find the common problems that people are working on within the different firms. We do research that can address those common problems. And quite often the research comes first, and then what follows is a benchmark or a standard or a framework that can be adopted more broadly. So always customer driven within the firms. We're designing things around the problems that matter to people in finance.
Well, thanks for joining us on the latest episode of the Alpha Intelligence Podcast.